Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. I'm so glad to welcome my colleague, Dr. Laurie Smaldone, who is the head of our regulatory practice at SSI Strategy. For today's conversation, we're going to reflect a bit on the last episode where we had Dr. Ed Kaye, the CEO of Stoke Therapeutics, on the show to talk about patient-focused drug development, the challenges of developing a first-in-class novel therapeutic, and really how to get the backing you need to develop those drugs effectively. Today, we're going to, with Laurie, reflect on a number of those similar themes and really advance how we think about that patient-focused drug development in the regulatory context and how we really elevate and tell that story to investors, the board, and other key stakeholders throughout the development cycle. Laurie, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, Kim, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. It's one of my favorite topics, actually, so I'm very excited.
That's great. Thank you, Laurie. To start us off, maybe you can give a little bit of your personal background and really how patient-focused drug development has been a critical part of your personal career path.
Yeah, Kim. So as you know, I'm a physician by training. I'm an oncologist and have been, in academic medicine and then moved into the pharmaceutical industry pretty early in my career and was part of the HIV/AIDS drug development era. And it was so clear at that point in time, and moving from being, doing oncology drug development and having to be pulled into something completely new to me, which kind of has been the signature of my career, is always doing something new every 2 or 3 years, but we'll come back to that. But what was really interesting at the time was the incredible importance of talking to patients, because people really didn't understand the natural history of AIDS other than the fact that people were dying. Obviously, we had no endpoints at that time. We didn't even have the technology at that time to monitor patients the way we can today. And so that was really early in my career, understanding the value of the patients and input, to the point where even when we had products on the market, we had to go back to the patients and say, how is it working? How are you tolerating it? Are you able to take this? It's chronic therapy. Are you able to take this? Are you having nausea and vomiting? Can you swallow it? I mean, questions like that. So it's very early in my career, I was really schooled by necessity in understanding and appreciating the value of the patient as just being just another stakeholder, like the regulators, like the KOLs, like your experts, and really have seen that play out in multiple disease areas, not just infectious diseases, obviously in cancer, obviously in neurologic disorders, rare neurologic disorders, and as we were talking about today, rare diseases where you really have to learn from the patients, because it's not something, certainly many of these genetic diseases are not known to most practicing clinicians, are not taught necessarily, and are emerging, and there are so many disorders that we know so little about, and really speaking to the people who are affected and their caregivers becomes really essential.
That's such a great point. And what an incredible experience you had to work on the earliest drug development for HIV/AIDS. And looking at news over the last 7 days for us here, we've seen such incredible development with near complete halt of any detection of HIV. So I'm sure just seeing the evolution of development specifically for that disease and how much we know now is an incredible testament to some of the early foundations that were built. So that's a really cool experience that you've had. Along those same lines, Laurie, I'd love to parlay some of those experiences into some of the regulatory framework where you spend a lot of your time today. How have you learned from the patient to tell the story to regulators? And to your point, so little is known, especially around rare disease, among practicing physicians, let alone the regulators who are not living these diseases day in and day out. They're looking at hundreds of disease states at a given point in time. How are you leveraging the partnership with patients to educate and tell the story to regulators? And how do you do that? Where do you start?
Well, you start early. And particularly, even if it's a well-known disorder where there's a lot of patient advocacy, such as breast cancer, for example, it is so important early on in developing a new product for a disease like breast cancer or for a rare disorder where very little is understood, to reach out to the advocacy organizations and the foundations and really create a partnership and really explain to them what you're trying to do, what your product is trying to achieve. But it's a two-way street, right? Because you really want to gain access to the patient's experience. And often the advocacy groups are a great way to do that. There are occasions where there are disorders that are poorly organized and where you almost have to forge advocacy and work with other partners to make that happen. And I've had that experience as well. But starting early in the drug development, even as you're planning, even before you're in the clinic, to reach out to advocacy organizations if they exist, or start to work to develop them, is really the first step. And there's a lot of open doors from the regulatory perspective, both in the US and Europe, to bring the patient's experience to the regulators. There are patient organizations and groups that the FDA, for example, reaches out to for them to learn around a particular disease state, and particularly for rare disease. And I've been involved in bringing patients to an FDA meeting because it was just so important for that particular symptomatology or quality of life experience for the regulators to understand, and then try to work with the sponsor to translate back to, well, what does that mean in terms, how are you going to monitor that particular? Is it that you can't, is that you feel full after eating, or you're feeling nauseated? Those are different things, how do I measure those things, as an example? So I think there are many more avenues for regulators to learn from the patients. And the other experience I have, as you know, is having spent many, many years preparing teams for advisory committee meetings. And in advisory committee meetings, it is all about benefit risk in the practicing situation. And the voice of the patient becomes extremely important there, particularly for diseases that are poorly known or understood by the committee, where bringing patients to the open public hearing, for example, for them to voice what their issues are, what are their priorities, what is most important for them in terms of what improved quality of life really means, or improved time to disease progression, makes all the difference in the world when you're trying to weigh sometimes imperfect information on a benefit risk, for a benefit risk decision. And the patient voice can sometimes make a really big difference and fill in the holes, because drug development is not perfect. We do the best we can, and it's really important to understand what it means for patients and for caregivers and family members who are dealing with many of these very difficult issues.
Completely agree with the imperfect nature of how we operate. It's unfortunately a little bit more art than science in a number of areas. And if we were in the position where every therapy we were working on was curative, I think we'd be having a very different conversation. But when we're talking about disease modifying and different levels of disease modifying, if somebody that has been wheelchair bound and they can now walk, there is such a clear visual representation. But when the endpoints or the measurement approach is unclear and or just not as visibly representative of what's happening with the disease, it's so much harder to articulate what that is and what's actually going to be meaningful. And when it comes to regulators, Laurie, I'd love for you to opine on this, how they need to be thinking about the critical endpoints and biomarkers in the trials that we're running, and how developers can really establish those. Because I know in my own experience, I'm working with so many different organizations that are cycling through the big question mark of, is this the right endpoint? Or, the agency is pushing me towards this one endpoint, but everybody knows that measurement scale is terrible. I don't have another option. So I'm going to do these 4 other things to supplement it. So maybe you could give some thoughts about how we even drive an endpoint strategy in partnership with regulators to really tell the best possible story for the patient.
Yeah, it is hard. And it's particularly hard when you're dealing with a disease that it has no treatment and there's no precedent, which a lot of rare disorders are in that basket. And so you are inventing the endpoint, and that endpoint has to be clinically meaningful to support regulatory approval and eventually to support someone to pay for it, right? Because that's what they're looking for. Is it clinically meaningful, and and how does that look relative to other interventions that could be any number of things that are not medicinal in nature? So it is part of that whole early thinking strategy that becomes so important, that before we rush into trials and rush into designing things, to really take the time to pull together a variety of disciplines, including outside experts and opinion leaders, to really start to map out, are there biomarkers? If there are biomarkers, how well do those biomarkers predict anything about the disease, or is it just something we can monitor because we know we can monitor? And does it have a relationship to clinical benefit? Those are incredibly important questions. And obviously, if you do have a biomarker that does predict eventual clinical benefit, from a regulatory perspective, it starts opening up doors for accelerated regulatory pathways like accelerated approval in the US, conditional approval in Europe, for example. So the whole way to, and I like the way you said, there's people try to throw the kitchen sink at, we're going to look at this, and this. That's costly. And that's a lot of burden for the patient in the clinical trial as well, right? So really trying to parse out what is most important. Are there markers that we think are likely to predict? Are there markers that we want to explore because maybe they're exploratory at this point in time, but we can learn something in this particular disease setting that can help us, with a later trial, for example. And then, as you said, Kim, you want to be able to kind of gauge this with regulators. And usually my recommendation is, don't go to one regulator, go to several, okay? Because we are developing drugs for patients around the world. In rare disease, there could be pockets of these patients in certain areas and not in other areas, and the epidemiology will teach you that. And you do want to learn from as many inputs as possible to really come with the best possible strategy for endpoint selection, secondary endpoint selection, biomarker selection, and really try to do this in a way that's pragmatic and that's possible, it's feasible, without making it burdensome for the patients, overly costly, and obviously learning from other trials that are also ongoing. So, and regulators are, there is a lot of, again, open doors to have these types of conversations around, how do we go from not knowing what the right clinical endpoints are to really moving along that path and identifying possible markers and possible other clinical endpoints that are important, including patient-reported outcomes, which have many drugs have been approved simply on patient-reported outcomes, because that's really the best measure of identifying some point of benefit when you're dealing with chronic diseases where there are multiple impacts on disease symptomatology, for example, on how the body functions. So those are just some examples, but it does require a plan. It does require a lot of forward thinking, a lot of forward planning, and working with regulators to come to some form of agreement. And I've been in situations where even when that happens, you're surprised, because your primary what happens if your primary endpoint and your secondary endpoint are telling you completely different things? And you have a very small sample size. I mean, just as an example. So it does require kind of there's obviously, we learn from each other in this industry, and again, that goes back to the patient voice, sometimes filling in the gap, because the trial may not end up with a perfect outcome, even with all the best planning in advance.
There's one thing that Ed said that really plays on what you just described, which is the idea of, you put in the time up front so you don't fail later. And it's very much in line with what you were just describing. We need to really deeply understand the natural history, understand what endpoints are going to be most meaningful, and then figure out how to tell that story in partnership with the patients so that we can develop the drug in the best way to serve them ultimately. And then, payers and regulators are going to understand when we're telling the most compelling story and doing the right thing for the patient ultimately. One thing I'm wondering, Laurie, in particular, I know you do sit and have sat on a number of different boards throughout your career as well. And so one of the key topics that we spoke with Ed about was, how do you convince your investors and your board to support the really long lead time that it might take to truly understand the epidemiology and the natural history of the disease so that you can, do it right and do it once? From your perspective in the board position, how do you really see that and partner with the organizations that you're supporting to help them do the right things at that right time and kind of recognize the long lead time it might take to get there?
Tricky, right? So because investors and board members both want things done, let's just say expeditiously. So, and sometimes you just you can't do that. You really need to invest. You need to plan, and I think it's important to be able, particularly for sponsors management, the CEO, the chief medical officer, global head of regulatory, to really be aligned internally on what's the best path forward, on why it's important, for example, to run a natural history study, and why just looking at publications and other data sets may be inadequate, and really providing evidence. Boards are evidence driven. They come from a variety of different backgrounds, individuals from a variety of different backgrounds, but they want to see why. Why is this necessary, right? So I think if there's alignment internally from the C-suite of the C-suite team on the rationale for example, running their own natural history study, which will take time, will take money, but it is, for that particular circumstance, maybe the best path forward, because the rest of the data out there is inadequate. And what are you going to do with inadequate data? It's useless. It's throwing money away. So you have to make that argument, and that's what boards want to hear. They want to hear good rationale, good evidence-driven reasons to invest in a certain way. And boards are also willing to obviously take risk to a point, and and obviously are there as fiduciaries to do the right thing. So I think in a way the boards are a great partner for the sponsor C-suite to be able to articulate together, the message of that story that has to go back to investors if the investors are not sitting on the board. So but it does take time, planning, and I'm going to call what I'm calling integrated thought, really pulling together, kind of a 360, from a clinical perspective, a regulatory perspective, a risk perspective, a safety perspective. What is it that we're trying to accomplish here, and why is this upfront investment so important now? Sometimes even before you're in the clinic, right? to really just establish that you understand the natural history of a disease, and to help identify what endpoints may be possible as you start to plan your program going forward. It gives you so much more, kind of leverage with regulators, eventually leverage with your investors, and yes, your catalyst may be a little late, but if everyone aligns behind it and the rationale, I have seen investors sign on to that.
A couple of things that you just said that really resonated were ultimately the idea of like slow now to speed up later. And when we're talking about the rare disease landscape, we are talking often about accelerated approval timelines. Sometimes you're only doing one trial, so you only have one shot on goal with 15 patients to get it right. And if you don't, really everything falls apart. And so taking that time really upfront and early and really thinking through what does success mean for this program and this company, and recognizing that the investors on the board are on the same side of the table. Everybody wants the same outcome here to ultimately help patients. And the question is, how do we do it in the best possible way? And sometimes, it might not be as fast as we would hope, but it might be slow now to speed up later in terms of our development cycle.
All that upfront reduces risk at the back end, and allows for much more engagement of the appropriate stakeholders, not just the regulators, but again, you're talking about the medical community, the experts, the patients, the advocacy groups. Sometimes you're dealing with multiple advocacy groups and they don't all agree on the same thing, and you have to work across that. So it is drug development, the biotech industry is a journey. But if you can, line up, it's just like, studying for an exam in college. If you study really well and you prepare really well, the exam goes quickly. So we want to be able to do everything up front as much as possible within reason, right? And be able to really manage your risk going forward, and put a plan in place that you can feel good about. Obviously, having touch points with regulators and other stakeholders along the way, as well as payers, which is really important to make sure you can actually, at the end of the day, address patient access, that patients are getting the drug is being paid for, patients know how to use it, pharmacies are in support. I mean, there's a lot of other downstream impacts of your product once it gets to commercialization that you have to think about, maybe not in the very early stages, but eventually. But you want to be able to build those building blocks so that you can get there and be, basically be proud that you shepherded a new medicine forward in a way that can be really meaningful for patients.
I will say I don't think we can add anything to what you just described. It is absolutely the ideal path that we hope all early biotechs are really striving for, and putting the patient first, ultimately defining success as a circumstance where every patient that could possibly benefit from your drug has the ability to use it in any way that they possibly can, and to develop that drug with that vision in mind every single day, and to drive a culture within the organization to be able to do that. So Laurie, thank you so much for joining today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.